Alex Harris is a pioneering American photographer whose career spans over 5 decades. Harris has captured evocative images of the American South, New Mexico, Alaska, and Cuba. His work is showcased in some of the world's most prestigious collections, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the J. Paul Getty Museum. A recipient of both a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship, Harris has published 15 books, including River of Traps, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and The Idea of Cuba. Beyond his photography, Harris is also an influential educator. He founded the Center for Documentary Photography at Duke University and co-founded the acclaimed Center for Documentary Studies. Today on The Crit House, Alex Harris discusses his photographic influences from Josef Koudelka, photography from the Alaskan Yupik people, Paul Kwilecki, Joel Meyerowitz, and Alex's wife, Margaret Sartor.
Well, Alex Harris, it's a pleasure to have you on The Crit House. You come to us at the recommendation of another photographer who recommended your work in her myFIVE series, Sharon Brody, who was a student of yours back in the day. And it's always nice to have somebody who was whose imagery was on as a myFIVE to be on the myFIVE. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really the best recommendation I can think of to come from a former student, though it reminds me of my daughter when she was younger, or maybe a young teen, and we used to have people visit us at the house, and it turns out that many of them were my wife's former students. And I remember her saying to me several times, "Dad, is there anyone who wasn't your former student?" So I appreciate that recommendation, but I think that's a wide net.
Well, you have great influence not only as a instructor, as a professor, but also as a photographer, as a editor, all the things you've done. Can you tell us a little bit about like who you are? I mean, I know you're a photographer, but you're so much else. You know, when people say, "What do you do?" What do you tell them?
Well, I say I'm a photographer, basically, but I was lucky enough at a relatively young age to fall into the world at Duke University, where I was told I should teach some classes. And in order to teach those classes, I had to try to make sense not just of my own work, my students' work, but the tradition in which I thought we were working. And so I began to really look at the history of photography, to look at what then was called documentary photography. At any rate, after teaching for a number of years, I began to be able to write about my own work and photography. But I guess I would like to think of myself more as a narrative artist, someone who moves through the world and tries to render it instinctively and in a personal way, but to try to speak in the first person with my photographs. In other words, I'm not pronouncing that this is the way it is, that this is something that you should admire or try to change, but this is the way that I see the world and the way people or the way I respond to a place or people and vice versa.
You've been given this assignment, 5 photographs or 5 works of art or 5 photographers to talk about. What was your thought process in trying to figure out what those 5 were going to be?
Well, I think when I was starting out in photography was when the influences meant the most to me, because I think we're all, if we're serious about being a photographer, a writer, a narrative person, trying to find our voice, establish a voice. And I looked for people whose work really helped me think about what is it that they're doing that I admire, and how did they do it? What do they have to teach me and us? And sometimes they would write about their work. Sometimes I knew them personally, but it was something that had something I aspired towards or that I learned from. And I think the list should have been maybe 8 or 9, but I was able to cut it down to 5 just for you and for this.
Sorry for the constraint. Let's take a look at your images. So I was very happy to see that Josef Koudelka is one of your 5. he was one of my five as well. So tell us why he and his work is here.
Well, when I first saw Koudelka's book, Gypsies, was around 1975 when it was published. And at the time, I was photographing I'd been photographing in Inuit villages in Alaska. I was just beginning to photograph in Yupik villages in Alaska. And Koudelka's photographs of the gypsies had an enormous impact on me because of the way that he was able to get inside that world as a person and as a photographer. I thought about my preconceptions of the gypsies as one of the most persecuted and denigrated peoples in Europe. And yet, Koudelka shows us another world and just shows us, I guess, just such joy in this picture, such energy in this picture, and such mystery in this picture in a way that, he's standing right in the path of these oncoming children sliding down an icy slope.
Yeah.
And also, so he's inside that world and he brings us inside it. People are looking at him, some people aren't. But look at how he uses the lens. He gives us enough of the landscape. He shows us people in the picture who don't realize they're in the picture. He often uses a wide angle lens in this way. And I think it's just brilliantly seen. And I'm looking at it more closely now, and you can see some of the people inside that scrum of youth. They look like young women. They're really looking at him and with such smiles. He's someone who's known there and,
Yes.
and trusted there.
Now you had a second image from Koudelka that you sent as well. So tell us about this image and why you wanted to send the second.
Well, there's so many Koudelka pictures I could have shown that were just the most devastating, some of the most devastating or intimate moments. I chose this one because I think it's about the nature of portraiture. And here's a young woman on her wedding day. You can see she's a little tense the way she's holding her hand there against her dress. She's holding flowers. And as far as she knows, she's the only one in the photograph, and he's photographing her. But there's probably her younger sister and her grandmother looking out the window, not knowing they're in the picture. And again, this is something brilliant that Koudelka does. He teaches about how to use the lens and how to get things in the lens that will be authentic, that will feel authentic. So you have an authentic look from this young woman. But then you look above her and you get much more of a sense of her family life. But you also I think a lot of pictures work on a subliminal level. And subliminally, what do we have here? We have this woman looking at us on her wedding day. We have her above her left shoulder as a younger woman and above her right shoulder as an old woman. And it's almost like her entire life is right there in this frame for us in this photograph with those extraordinary crumbling walls behind her of the building. It's a picture that, like so many of his photographs, is it's poetic. It hints at something, but it doesn't tell us everything, and therefore we engage with it.
Well, I love how you talk about it. I love how you talk about Koudelka. Now, you mentioned a project in Alaska with the Yupik people. You've now moved on to your second selection with these snapshots from Alaska. Tell us about this.
So I made 5 trips to Alaska between 1973 and 1978 to ostensibly to work on a book with Robert Coles about life in remote Inuit and Yupik villages. But it became something more than that, I think, for me. We did publish a book together, but I've recently gone back and looked at my work from that time. One of the things I found, and I'd seen some of it when we published our book, was that almost as a favor to people, when I would come to a village, I would say, look, I'd love to look at your family album. If there are any pictures here that you would like me to copy, I'll copy it and bring it back to you on my next trip. And I I remember an older man coming up to me at one point and saying that he heard I was copying pictures and could I copy one for him? And I said, of course, let's go to your house and you show me where it is. And he said, oh, I've got it right here. And he pulled out his wallet and he pulled out this photograph of his wife who had died some years before that was so damaged by the passage of time and by his handling of it. At one point, he told me he'd had to sew it back together with dental floss. And, I didn't think much of it. I copied the picture. I brought it back to him. But then when I looked at it large, I saw that, first of all, the landscape, that flat landscape is there that I became so familiar with on the southern Bering Sea coast. But look at her face and look at the center of this picture, and you can see a kind of a smile there, a warmth there, that's just in the tiniest part of this picture. It's smaller than many of the defects in the picture.
Yeah.
And it really taught me two things, how little it is that we really need of a human expression in order to be able to read that person. And it also, taught me that maybe I was missing something in the way I was photographing people there, that maybe my own work was, it wasn't capturing a spirit that I saw in some of these snapshots.
I have to say, just looking at this while you're talking to it and spending some time with it while we're chatting, it's really one of the most powerful images we've shown on this program. It's brilliant, amazing.
Thank you. I agree. I mean, I don't know the program, but it's one that I'm really drawn to.
I see why, especially by your description of it and recognizing that smile that is it's almost indecipherable, but when you look at it, you'd see it, you feel it, especially with the story that this came out of his wallet.
Yes.
You sent another image from the people in Alaska, and which is this one.
Well, I made a lot of photographs at this location. This is on the beach at a village called Tanunuk on the southern Bering Sea coast. And I spent quite a lot of time. I visited Tanunuk 3 times for at least a couple of months each time. Sort of like Koudelka, this image kind of breaks all the rules in terms of it's not in focus, it's damaged by light, it's damaged by time, and yet it's so full of life and joy, and it shows the landscape as well. I think my first photographs in these villages were really about the images that I brought with me in my mind about what Inuit and Yupik life would be like, and I photographed people as stoic and hardworking and quite beautiful and powerful pictures, but my pictures weren't about the flow of everyday life. And it was photographs like this, and the first one I showed you, that really allowed me to help me to open up as a photographer. And I think if you look at some of my photographs from those villages now, you'll see a lot of the qualities that you find in these snapshots as well.
That's fantastic. Now we've taken a shift in focus. Is it Kwilecki? I don't know how to pronounce that.
His name is Kwilecki, Paul Kwilecki.
Oh, is that a typo there?
No, that's how you pronounce it.
Oh, that's how you pronounce it.
And I wish I could replicate his southern accent. He would say, "I'm Paul Kwilecki. I'm Paul Kwilecki from South." And he was a very educated man. He had gone to Emory University in Atlanta. I believe his father was the mayor of this town, Bainbridge, Georgia. Paul ran a hardware store in Bainbridge. And in the mid 50s, he saw Eugene Smith's photographs and became fascinated by the idea of photographing, but not just photographing anything, photographing Decatur County, Georgia. And ultimately, he began to devote himself to photography. He sold his hardware store, and he spent the remainder of his life as a photographer of this one county. Now, I met Paul, just brief background. I met him because he was invited to Duke by a photography club. And I think everyone there was just so impressed with this man who was 20 some years older than us, who was so devoted to photography and passionate about it, and who could speak about it in such an articulate way. And he taught us a lot about photography, not so much by what he said, but by his pictures like this one. Um, so Paul would photograph in series. One of his series was the shopping mall or the shopping center, most inside, but some outside. And he would work on a series for 6 months or so, choose 12 or 15 pictures that he thought were his best pictures, and then move on to something else and maybe put those aside. And when you look at his photographs, they seem so quiet and so like, okay, it's an old couple and they're sitting there and they're eating ice cream and probably been married for a long time. And maybe he didn't frame it so well because, there's got a lot of cars and a shopping cart over there. And then when you really begin to look at the picture and think about it, uh, the lady has finished about half her cone. She's looking down. He's leaning forward and they're not speaking. That cone is almost in his nose, but he hasn't taken a lick. And what does that mean? Has he been sitting there fuming over something, thinking about something? Uh, there's just this kind of tension in the picture that you can read if you really look at it. And then you think about, okay, well, what is this picture really about? How is it framed? And what is he showing us? And so much of what Paul did was he showed us the environment that we've created for ourselves, that we move through. And what does that environment do to us? What does it mean to sit on that bench in that place for these people and for all of us to move through that particular kind of world?
This was another of his images that he sent, and it seems to have all of those characteristics in it as well.
Yes, city workers was one of the things he focused on, and uh, I think of Robert Adams when he wrote in that book Beauty and Photography. The thing that he looked for in any landscape picture, which you could argue maybe this is a kind of a landscape, was geography, autobiography, and metaphor. The geography is Decatur County, it's Bainbridge, Georgia. Uh, Autobiography, well, it's Paul Kwilecki, who spent a lifetime living there and everyone knew him. I mean, imagine you run the hardware store. Most people know you. Most people have met you in that town. They don't pay much attention to you. But then you come to metaphor. And when you come to metaphor, look at the way he's photographed these men. They're kind of heroic in a certain way. They're beautiful the way that they're framed there. But the first thing your eye goes toward is what? It's that cross on the neck of the young man in the foreground. And then you look a little closer, or maybe you step back and you realize, it almost looks like he's carrying a cross. He's bearing a cross. And so you have the metaphor, and then you think of the metaphor, or you think of the story of race in the South and the cross that many people have to bear. And this is just typical of Paul's pictures. They're just so rich and full of meaning, and they hint at so much more than they show.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing it. When we come close to my home here in Massachusetts, I assume this is from Cape Light, Joel Meyerowitz down on Cape Cod.
Cape Light came out in 1978. At the time, I'd been photographing Inuit and Yupik villages in black and white, but I'd been photographing mostly in northern New Mexico in small Hispanic and Native American pueblos there. And I'd been photographing in black and white with a relatively small camera, maybe a medium format camera, making portraits mostly. And when this book came out, I had just received a Guggenheim, and later the next year I got a Guggenheim. And I said in that application that I wanted to photograph in color, in large format, and sort of look at the world I'd been looking at for 8 years or so, but look at it in a new way. And this book comes out, and it kind of gave me permission, but I think it gave a whole generation of photographers who've been working in black and white permission to photograph in color, to respond to the world in color. and to respond to light in a way that we hadn't paid attention to before because we hadn't been photographing in color. And if you just look at this picture, it's you could photograph a sunset in many ways on the Cape, but here he's managed to include at least three kinds of light: the light that's hitting these buildings and the land from the setting sun, that fantastic green light inside the telephone booth, and then those little light bulbs that are outside those buildings. It's a picture that really helped me enormously, not just this, but other photographs of his, to make that transition to color, to make that transition to large format photography. He's using an 8x10 camera. I began to use a 4x5 inch camera. But he did something else that's really important, Jeff, which is that he gave away some of his secrets. At the back of that book, he tells you, well, I'm using a particular film. It's called Vericolor Type L film. And that film is basically balanced for tungsten light. But the way I deal with that is I put an 85B filter on the front of my lens, and then that balances it back towards daylight. The only problem is it makes the film very slow. So the ISO or ASA might go down to 32 or something. So your exposures have to be long. And then you have to think about reciprocity if your exposures are long. At any rate, he gave me the secret to this film and how to use it. And that's what I began to use in northern New Mexico. That's the short story about Joel Meyerowitz. The longer story is that I thought, if I'm going to make photographs in color, I don't want them to be about color. So I'm just going to pretend it's in black and white, and I'm going to photograph it the way I would have in black and white. And I think I failed for about 6 months to make a decent photograph. And then finally, there was one picture of mine that showed me that if you respond to color, you're also responding to culture, and you're responding to personality. You're responding to the quirkiness of whoever painted that house, and whatever paint happened to be in the store that month. I began to respond to color, and things started working out for me in New Mexico.
I have to say that that is such a great way of talking about the shift to color, because I don't see the wall back on my little project I'm working on here. I'm a black and white guy. I've never been able to think in color, but that's like the first time anyone has said anything that made me think, oh, that's how you shoot color. I may have to rethink my whole process now. So this is another image from Joel, also color.
Yeah, and it's a picture that is in a way thumbing its nose at painting and saying that, well, we can do still lifes too. It looks like he's been looking at paintings of fruit in probably what's the New York Times there. And it's I think, a picture that showed me that you can look at the world. This isn't so much about color, but that it doesn't have to be a grand landscape of something. It doesn't have to show us everything that Koudelka tried to get into his lens. You can focus in on certain aspects of people's lives, and that will tell a story too. And in my own work in New Mexico, particularly, I began to both step back and think I could make a portrait of a village the same way you might make a portrait of a person. But I would also, when I was inside people's homes, look for details in those homes that I could photograph that would add up to something if you saw it next to other photographs of that culture or of that home or of that place.
I think you're making me a better photographer, but just in this conversation. I just love it. So now we pick it into a very personal influence. Margaret Sartor, who's your wife, as I understand, right?
Margaret is my wife. When we met and started working together, I was working and Margaret began to work with me on a book about a photographer named Gertrude Blum in southern Mexico. This is probably around 1981 or so. And we went down to her home in Chiapas, Mexico. The book eventually became Gertrude Blum Bearing Witness, but we came there to look at her body of work. She'd been looked at mostly as an environmentalist and as a fighter for saving a rainforest there. And we had 40,000 of her images contacted on a contact sheet that we could look at and then request prints. And we made one trip down there to begin to look at her archive. When we made our second trip, we were already married because part of that is all the things that go into why two people are drawn and attracted to each other. But we found that we worked so well together and saw the world in a way that we helped each other in looking at pictures, and we were able to narrow that body of work down and create a sequence and an edit that I believe really worked. And that's a conversation that's continued through looking at her work, through looking at my own work. The particular photograph you're looking at now was during the last great eclipse that occurred here in North Carolina. I chose it because it's one of many portraits I made of Margaret over the years, but I chose it because it's a picture about seeing, and it's about seeing the world through glasses, which is like seeing it through a lens, and while you're doing that, light is falling on you as well, and you're part of that world you're looking at. The thing I think I could talk about so many projects and so many books that Margaret and I have done together. She started as a graphic designer, and so that book River of Traps that I mentioned, she ended up not only helping edit but design that. She designed the first book I did in northern New Mexico on my own, which is called Red, White, Blue, and God Bless You, by looking at the way people decorated and painting their homes and used that to as the design motif for the book. But what I really wanted to mention with this photograph is that Margaret understood that a photograph of someone isn't necessarily that person. You're not, she was willing to be photographed and open to being photographed, and she photographed me as well. And when we had children, 8 years into our marriage, the fact that I was photographing Margaret and began photographing our children, she did as well, just became part of our lives. And it's something that was in the background of so much I did in terms of other so-called projects. In a way, this did help me with the project because when I started thinking that I wanted to photograph in Cuba, and I'd done one body of work there, and I knew the next time I wanted to photograph on the street in Cuba, I got a rangefinder camera, which this picture is made with. Because it was a medium format camera and I could use it quickly. And I began to practice on it with Margaret and with my children who were young at the time and running around. And I thought if I can,
Fast.
after them running around, I can do anything. And that camera became the camera that I used not only in Cuba, but to photograph my family over many, many years. And I mention it now because it's something my daughter, who's one of the main subjects in that body of work, is helping me edit, and she's going to write a text to it. I'm working on my text. And I think I had one other picture of Margaret. It's a picture worth looking at because it shows that it's the first photograph I made of her when I was learning to use a large format camera. She was in New Mexico. I think it speaks to what makes a portrait work, really. I used to think that what a portrait was really about is, and we've all thought this way, you get people to relax, they sort of open up and they show something about themselves that, the camera can capture. And what was interesting about this portrait of Margaret is that it's not just what she shows and how beautiful she is in that image and how beautiful the light is that's striking her, but it's what she holds back. It's someone who's getting to know another person, who's on some level, even though we're going to be married shortly thereafter, still trying to figure out this person. And I think it's a really rich picture for that reason. It makes you want to look at it and think about, well, what's really going on here?
Let me ask you one final question, just because it's interesting with your discussion of Margaret. One of the things about the reason for me doing this program, the Crit House, is in large part because it's a way for me to have a community and have other people who can help me understand photography and learn. But I'm just fascinated by this, the great benefit of having somebody who is a partner as close to you as you and Margaret seem to be. I just had a workshop a couple of weeks ago with Alex Webb and Rebecca Norris Webb, and watched them work together. And clearly there's something that they bring to each other to make them both better. And I had talked with both Tina Loit and Fred Conrad, who are with the New York Times, who are partners. And I think there's something that's there that provides more than people realize. And maybe I'm wrong. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit, how that plays out in your work and your life?
Well, I'd like to maybe speak about it in a bigger way, because I think I have in a way spoken about how that plays out in my life, but I think that it's what, say, Paul Kwilecki was hungry for when he came to Durham. He was in this community where people thought he was this quirky guy who was taking pictures. He didn't really talk about his work with his own wife. He had a daughter he could speak to, but I think we all need a kind of a community, and to have a sense that there's a community of people out there who at least want to see what we're doing, and who we might be able to speak about it with in a way that would be helpful to us. And that gets back to teaching and the idea of trying to teach photography. Uh, I remember I was lucky enough to be in a class with Walker Evans when I was an undergraduate at Yale. And one of the first things he told us was that, I hope you're not in this class because you want me to teach you photography. I can't teach you to be a photographer. What he did, and what Margaret and I have tried to do in our courses at Duke, is create an atmosphere in which we could do our own work and have an opportunity to maybe make some bad pictures, to try to move towards subjects that drew us, and to photograph those long enough so that you could begin to see, what is it that my best photographs say about my experience of the world? Not how do I feel about that place? What was it like to be there that day? But let's just choose the photographs that are the most interesting to me, even if they seem a little bit off subject. Begin to put those together and begin to see what it is that you're drawn to as a photographer, and feel free to move in that direction if it continues to draw you. And that's, I think, so much of the way we've taught our courses at Duke. And if you're lucky to have people who can help you recognize those pictures. So maybe this is by way of saying, if you're showing photographs to people, I would try to not just show them your so-called greatest hits or pictures from across a broad spectrum, but show them pictures that you made that you're really drawn to, but also other pictures that you like, but you're not quite sure why, and how does this fit together?
Well, I'm sure I could talk forever with you, so I don't want to keep you too long. Alex Harris, what a great conversation, and first of all, great images to discuss. Your eloquence in providing insight into not only their meaning to you, but the images themselves was fantastic. Thank you for all you have provided to us here on the program, and what you've been doing for photography for your whole life, it sounds like.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. And I think you're really onto something with this, not just with the Crit House, but with this idea of influences. It's a really important question to ask people. And I think it teaches the people you ask a lot as well, when they really have to narrow it down. So I appreciate being given this assignment. Thank you.
It's an editing challenge, isn't it?
It is.
Well, thank you again. And thank you all for watching The Crit House.